Helen Brooks was 72 years old when her only son told her she could no longer stay in his house. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, just the quiet click of a front door closing behind her as she stepped onto the porch, a worn-out suitcase in one hand and nothing else. Her grip on the handle was tight, like she was holding on to more than just clothes. Maybe she was holding on to the last pieces of a life she thought would never fall apart. Her son, Dylan, didn't look at her. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, a wall of silence between them. Behind him, his wife, Kara, leaned casually against the frame, her lips curled in the kind of half-smile people wear when they finally get what they want. "You can't stay here anymore, Mom," Dylan said flatly. "We've got bills, kids, and we just can't support you two. I'm sorry." That was it. No hug, no offer of help, no question about where she would go next. Just a woman with tired eyes and tired hands, stepping off the porch of a house she once helped pay for, dragging a suitcase that scraped against the sidewalk like it was whispering, "You're on your own now." She walked one slow step at a time, back slightly bent, heart heavier than her suitcase. But what Dylan didn't know, what no one knew, was that Helen Brooks was not nearly as helpless as she looked. Inside her modest leather purse, tucked between a worn handkerchief and an old lipstick case, was a debit card. That card connected her to a private trust account worth $1.4 million. And yet, she didn't cry. Not on the sidewalk. Not 3 blocks later, sitting alone on a wooden bench at the bus stop. Not even when she saw the house disappearing behind her in the distance. Because sometimes silence doesn't just hurt. It awakens something deeper. Helen didn't tell anyone why she left her job at the church thrift store. Everyone assumed she had been let go, that maybe her age or slowing pace had caught up with her. But the truth was, Helen had resigned quietly, deliberately. Her back had been giving out. The doctor warned her that lifting boxes could cause permanent damage. So she smiled, thanked the pastor, and said it was time for her to rest. And she meant it. Not just rest from work, but from a lifetime of pushing through pain, of pretending she didn't need help. For over 40 years, Helen had worked tirelessly scrubbing motel bathrooms, wiping hospital floors, folding bed sheets in homes that weren't her own. She had done it all alone after her husband died in a scaffolding collapse at the factory. Dylan was only 9 when that happened. She remembered skipping meals so he could eat, walking to double shifts so he could have textbooks. Not once did she regret it. She did it all for love. But what she had never prepared for was the day that love would not be returned. Not with warmth, not with loyalty, just rejection. Her son, the boy she protected through storms and scraped knees, now saw her as nothing more than a financial inconvenience, a line item in a monthly budget. Still, she didn't hate him. She couldn't. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she held tightly to the quiet secret resting inside her purse. Years ago, after her husband's death, the insurance company sent a small payout. Hidden behind the policy letter, there had been something unexpected: a deed. 40 acres of remote land, left behind by her husband's great uncle, in a county so far out no one had even visited it. Everyone told her to sell it. "It's just rocks and dirt," they said. "No water, no utilities, not even a road. Take the $3,000 and let it go." But something in Helen had said no. Every year, even when she could barely afford groceries, she paid the property taxes. Just in case. Because sometimes holding on to what others call worthless becomes the very thing that saves you. Helen's life had been a quiet string of sacrifices. No one applauded when she washed uniforms at midnight or when she sewed torn shoes so Dylan wouldn't be embarrassed at school. No one saw the way her hands cracked from scrubbing without gloves or how she'd pretend to already be full so Dylan could have seconds at dinner. It wasn't heroism. It was just motherhood, the kind that lives in the shadows of grocery lists and unpaid bills. The kind that never asks for recognition. But the hardest part, Helen realized now, wasn't the struggle. It was the silence that came after the invisibility. She had once believed that love would create memory, that her sacrifices would become part of her son's bones, shaping who he became. So the truth was, time had a cruel way of erasing the people who made you. Especially when those people no longer served a purpose. She sat at the bus stop, hands resting on her purse, watching strangers walk past like she wasn't there. And for a moment, she wondered if maybe she really wasn't. She remembered one winter when she and Dylan had shared a single heater in a cramped apartment. She'd curl up on the floor near his bed, making sure he stayed warm. That same boy had now closed a door on her, not with anger but with indifference. And that hurt more. Still, Helen didn't let that bitterness take root. Instead, she opened her purse and carefully unfolded an old document, yellowed at the edges. It was the land deed, the one everyone told her to get rid of, the land no one had wanted. Last fall, a man in a gray suit had shown up at the church, asking for Helen Brooks. He worked for a renewable energy company. They were building a solar plant in that part of the state and needed her land. He made an offer. Helen didn't blink. She asked one question. "Can this stay private?" 3 weeks later, the money was wired to a private trust in her late husband's name. To everyone else, she was still Miss Helen with her thrift store apron. But now, she had something they couldn't see. Options. That night, Helen didn't check into a hotel or call an old friend for help. She walked 2 miles to a women's shelter on the edge of downtown, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She wanted to sit beside people who wouldn't look at her like a problem to be solved. People who wouldn't ask what she had or why she had lost it. The shelter was dimly lit, the air filled with the smell of canned sumac and worn fabric. A volunteer handed her a blanket. Another gave her a bowl of stew. Helen found a corner and sat down, listening quietly. She shared the snacks in her bag, half a sandwich, a few wrapped candies, nothing special. But to the woman crying softly beside her, it was more than food. It was kindness. Helen held her hand as she wept about a daughter who hadn't called in 3 years. Someone cracked a joke about the tasteless stew, and Helen laughed a soft, real laugh that had been buried for years. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, not for what she could give, not for what she had lost, but just for being there. The next morning, she visited a rundown cottage on the far side of town. Its windows were cracked, paint chipped away by years of wind and rain. Wild vines curled up the porch railings like the house was being reclaimed by time. She paid cash, quietly. No one asked questions. 3 weeks later, the cottage had been transformed. New windows, fresh paint, a fixed roof, and solar panels on top. The garden out back was tilled and blooming. But still, no one knew it belonged to her. She didn't hang a nameplate. She didn't tell the neighbors. She didn't call Dylan. She wasn't looking for revenge. She wasn't trying to prove a point. What Helen wanted was something else entirely, to build a place that would never shut its door on someone just because they had nothing left. And now she finally could. Not because she had millions, but because she had peace, clarity, and a vision rooted in empathy. Helen named the property Helen's Table, though the name never appeared on any paperwork. Instead, she quietly created a legal entity, Grace Holdings LLC, that owned the building and the land. On the surface, it was just a renovated cottage, but inside it was something far more meaningful. She started small. A hot meal served every evening, a shelf of warm blankets and donated coats. A few sleeping mats cleaned and ready each night, no intake forms, no interviews. Just open doors and a pot of soup that never ran out. Over time, word spread. Volunteers showed up. Some were people Helen had once met at the shelter. Others came from churches or schools. One woman brought boxes of children's books. A retired plumber fixed the bathroom for free. Helen never told anyone she was the founder. When people asked who was in charge, she just smiled and pointed to the building itself. "It runs on kindness," she'd say. What she really meant was that it ran on the memory of every time she'd been overlooked, dismissed, or turned away. She remembered what it felt like to be invisible, and so she built a place where people could be seen again. She used the trust money to fund repairs at youth centers, help struggling families pay their utility bills, and sponsor GED classes. But everything was done quietly. Donations came under different names, all routed through Grace Holdings. She didn't want the spotlight. She didn't want Dylan or Kara to show up pretending to care. She didn't want pity or attention. She just wanted to rewrite what safety looked like for people like her, for those who had been told they were too old, too broken, or too poor to matter. And slowly, Helen's Table became more than a shelter. It became a rhythm. Soup simmered on the stove each morning. The back garden was full of laughter and sunflowers taller than most of the kids who came through. Every Friday night, the cottage glowed with warm light and conversation as neighbors gathered to share food, stories, and music. No one was turned away. No one had to prove anything. They just came, and they were welcome. While Helen's life blossomed quietly, Dylan's began to unravel in ways he never saw coming. At first, it was small things: a missed mortgage payment here, a rising credit card bill there. Then Kara started sleeping in the guest room more often. She said she needed space, said he wasn't the man she married anymore. When the foreclosure notice arrived, she didn't fight. She packed up their 2 kids and moved in with her sister. Dylan tried to stay afloat. He picked up warehouse shifts, delivered groceries at night, even sold his old guitar to make rent on a dingy basement apartment. But nothing stuck. Every day felt like a slow slide into something heavier. There were nights he skipped dinner just to stretch a dwindling paycheck. Nights when he stared at the ceiling and thought about his mom, not the way she looked when she was tired, but the way she used to hum while folding his laundry or slip a $5 bill into his jacket pocket, just in case. But he never called her. Pride is strange like that. It can let you starve before it lets you apologize. One rainy afternoon, Dylan ducked into the public library just to stay dry. He wandered past the front desk, dripping on the floor, when something caught his eye. A cream-colored flyer pinned to the bulletin board. It read, "Helen's Table Meals, Shelter, Support, No One Left Behind." The logo was carved into a small wooden image at the top, a table framed by wildflowers. It looked oddly familiar. Dylan stared at it, heart pounding. It couldn't be, could it? He ripped the flyer from the board and read the address 3 times. It was across town, an old part of the neighborhood he'd walked through 100 times. He had never noticed the building. That night he barely slept. Something gnawed at him. Guilt, maybe. Hope, possibly. Or maybe it was the realization that the one person he'd cast aside might have built something beautiful without him. By morning he made a decision. He would go, not to beg, not yet, but to see. To see if the woman he thought had nothing had quietly created everything. The next morning, Dylan walked across town in worn-out sneakers with soles that flapped slightly every time he took a step. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray, and the streets were mostly empty. He followed the address on the flyer until he reached a narrow lane lined with blooming trees and old stone walls. There it was, a small cottage with fresh paint, wooden window boxes filled with marigolds, and laughter spilling out from behind the front door. Children played in the garden, chasing bubbles that shimmered in the light. A thin line of steam curled from a metal vent on the roof, carrying the scent of fresh bread and something warm cooking on the stove. Above the doorway, carved neatly into a wooden arch, were the words, "Helen's Table, Everyone Has a Place." He hesitated. Then, as if pulled by something he couldn't name, he stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, not just the temperature, but the atmosphere. People moved gently with purpose. Volunteers folded blankets, stirred pots, refilled cups. It didn't feel like charity. It felt like home. And then he saw her. Behind the reception desk, in a beige cardigan, her silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears, sat a woman he hadn't really looked at in years. His mother. Helen looked up, eyes locking with his. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile, either. She just studied him for a moment, as if weighing something as implausible between them. Dylan froze. His throat tightened. The words wouldn't come. When they did, they were quiet and cracked. "I didn't know where else to go," he whispered. Helen stood slowly and walked around the desk, stopping just in front of him. She didn't touch him. She didn't ask questions. He looked at the floor. "I lost the house. Kara's gone. I have nothing." Silence stretched between them like a fragile bridge. Then Helen said, softly, "Come inside. You look cold." She led him to a small table, set down a mug of warm tea, and walked away without another word. And for the first time in his life, Dylan felt the weight of being forgiven before even asking for it. Dylan sat at the table for a long time, his hands wrapped around the mug like it might hold him together. He looked around the room, taking in every detail: the handmade curtains, the baskets of fresh fruit, the volunteers who moved with quiet joy. "This place," he finally said, barely louder than a breath, "it's yours." Helen, now seated across from him, gave a small nod. "I thought you had nothing," he said, eyes still scanning the room. "I had peace," she replied, "and enough." He blinked hard, emotion rising fast. "Why didn't you tell me? About the money? About any of this?" Helen tilted her head, her voice calm and steady. "Would it have changed anything?" He didn't answer. She continued. "I needed to know who would stand beside me when I had nothing to give. That's how I knew who to build this place for." Dylan swallowed. "I was awful to you. You trusted me, and I threw you out." Helen reached across the table, gently taking his hand in hers. "You forgot yourself," she said. "That doesn't mean you can't find your way back." And something in him cracked, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet release, like a dam giving way after too much pressure. Tears rolled down his cheeks in silence. He didn't sob. He didn't apologize. But he didn't have to. Helen saw it all in his face. In that moment, something passed between them that couldn't be put into words. Forgiveness, yes, but also recognition. For the first time, Dylan saw her not as mom, not as the woman who packed lunches or cleaned up his messes, but as a whole person. Someone who had been broken and still chose kindness. Days turned into weeks. Dylan showed up at Helen's table every morning. He fixed broken chairs, swept the front walk, repaired shelves, and sorted canned goods. He never asked to be paid. He never expected anything. He was just there. Like he was making up for every day he hadn't been. And Helen, she didn't say much. She didn't need to. Some things were already being rewritten, one quiet day at a time. One Friday evening, just as the sun dipped low behind the garden fence, Helen handed Dylan a sealed envelope. They were sitting on the front porch, watching the children chase fireflies while the smell of soup drifted from the kitchen. Dylan looked at her, puzzled. "What's this?" "Just something I think you should have," she said gently. He opened it slowly. Inside were 2 items: the original deed to the house she had once given him, and a voided check from the land she had sold. Both were framed side by side, behind a thin pane of glass. He stared at them, speechless. Helen took a breath. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "But now you know what happens when love comes before pride." He didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat closed up and he looked away, blinking quickly. But in that moment, something deep inside him shifted. He finally saw the truth, not just about her, but about himself. About the man he used to be, and the man she had always believed he could become. That fall, Helen passed away quietly in her sleep. There were no headlines, no long eulogies, just a simple wooden service in the garden behind Helen's table, attended by more than 100 people: neighbors, children, volunteers, women from the shelter, and men who'd once had nowhere to go. People she had fed, people she had held, people she had never turned away. Dylan stood at the front, holding her favorite apron in his hands. "My mother," he said softly, "once walked out of a house with nothing but a suitcase and a quiet heart." He paused, eyes glistening. But in that silence she built something bigger than any of us ever knew. He turned to the carved wooden sign above the entrance. It read, "The doors that close behind you can never match the ones you open for others." And with that, Dylan took a deep breath, set the apron down, and walked forward, not as a man broken by his past, but as someone now shaped by it. Not because his mother had money, but because she had chosen love over revenge, and grace over bitterness.